YouTube page, because I like to save these pearls of wisdoms for people can look at them whenever. So why don't we start with Quirino and tell us, please, how you got to Chico?
Good question. Love that. Yeah, they will be so surprised, maybe not too surprised, but I don't know, happy to hear that today is my 40th anniversary in this country.
Wow.
So I came to the United States exactly on the 11th of January of 1978.
You were a baby, right?
No. So and the way I came was fascinating because I came with very little knowledge of English. Probably my English was close to nothing. And when I arrived at LAX, at one point I was sort of shocked at the beginning, just that moment of pause and astonishment. But I thought maybe I have arrived in the wrong country.
Because?
Because I heard a lot of Spanish.
Oh.
And the first thing I did was I tried to ask somebody about the direction to the parking lot, and the fellow American policeman answered, a white man, so he answered in Spanish. So I tried to ask in English. He replied in Spanish. I said maybe I got the wrong plane. But anyway, I came to Chico in 2000. I hailed from Massachusetts after getting my PhD in Los Angeles at UCLA. So I went to Massachusetts, taught a little bit, and then before I got my job through Chico State, my wife did that first. So I just followed the lead, and that's 2000, June 2000.
When you first came here, what else was surprising besides all the Spanish?
The culture is rather different in terms of, say, social life. For example, the students were in the college I went to. Of course, I went to the largest, the biggest, the best. It's not. I don't want to brag about University of São Paulo, but University of São Paulo is the best university in the country. Some people would say, well, how about Pontifical Catholic University somewhere else, But we are still looking at publications, commitment, teaching, social connection, service. University of São Paulo is still the biggest and the greatest. So I had a really redeeming, beautiful experience coming from the interior. A kid from the interior going to a big city like that. The place where I lived as a kid was probably at the most 25,000 people. All of a sudden, São Paulo, over 10 million. So it's drastically different. So for me, it was a shock of an initial culture shock in terms of getting lost to getting found again. So the social life was, had it not been for at that time, my fiancée, who eventually became my wife, it would have been more dramatic. But the transition was made a lot easier because of my wife. So the expectations were such as, if I were to follow what was happening back in Brazil, was spend long hours at night partying. Not that we don't party here in Chico, or in other universities, but that was a huge expectation. And then I came quickly to realize that I can't do that. It was a quarter system, and of course, in a quarter system, at the blink of the eye, you are, you think you're in fall, you are ready to winter, and then the spring comes, and the year's over. It rolls really, really fast.
Right. Vivekanand, why did you come to Chico?
It's a very good question. always wanted to come to America, and one of the main reasons for that was to lead a better life. And India is one of the major countries in the world where it loses most of its significantly young population to brain drain to countries such as America and other developed countries, because India simply lacks the infrastructure in terms
and the
of
Gulf region too, right?
yes. And so I felt that if I were to see myself where I always wanted to see myself in terms of my career goals and this standard of life I had always dreamed for, I thought that America was the place to go. As far as schooling concerned, why precisely Chico? I always aspired to be a part of the CSU system, the California State University system, because I felt that, for me personally, given my inclinations towards electrical engineering or just engineering in general, I felt that California is the hub for a good success when it comes to launching myself into the corporate world. And so I applied to the CSU system, and eventually I got an admission at Chico State, and I felt, given the constraints, financially and other such considerations, I felt that Chico State is one of the best places to go, because it's not only cheap, but it has good professors and has a good infrastructure, and I could learn a lot. And, grades will speak for my performance, and I felt that, given my merits, it'll be quite easy for me to find employment.
Did your picture of the U.S. from, I assume, from media fit with what you saw when you actually got here?
Yes and no. Like how people say that you have to take everything with a grain of salt. That is what I always applied to whatever I perceived, because nothing is never as it always seems. So even when I was in India, I knew that media is not the accurate representation of what a culture is, because what people perceive Indian culture to be is what they look at media and interpret that, oh, in India they do this because in movies that's what happens. So I knew the same applies to United States. So I never was all that purchased into the whole idea of Hollywood and how the United States functions. I would say yes, because there's a lot about this culture where you do have the recognition of freedom for a citizen, and that in itself is a very comforting scenario. Again, it is quite appalling to see that there's certain measures of practices in culture, traditionally or otherwise, that are quite, I would say, unfitting for a healthy future. But that's everywhere.
Like what? What are you thinking?
So specifically when it comes to how people tend to focus too much on a certain affair, to the point where sometimes I feel that even rights, sometimes people take things too seriously. There's rights, people are becoming activists for rights that don't even matter.
Like what?
Simply put, there's a difference between recognizing your right to do something. I wouldn't like to specify, because it's something that I've accumulated over the years. It's not something I can just narrow it down to, because again, it's always a spectrum. It's never purely black and white. And so I would say that the idea that I'm coming from is more to do with how you need to let go to a certain extent. Knowledge is good, but everything is good in moderation, and you have to let go sometimes and look at it and say, okay, yes, that was a mistake, but that is not something that I have to take seriously to the point where I would accuse everything or everyone on that, in that regard.
Are you thinking of the Me Too movement, or do you have something specific in mind?
It would not be necessarily just limited to gender inequalities or issues as such. It could be to everything. Now, okay. If you want to get some examples, yes, gender inequality, immigration. How would you control exports? How would you control imports? What is it that determines the economy of this country? What is it that you need to worry about when you're talking about, denuclearization? So there's so many things, so many issues that I feel that people are getting too specific to the point where it's almost at the extreme end of the spectrum. Again, brings it back to that bandwidth of just being black or white. They don't look at it as a spectrum of things, that there's a degree and an extent to which something is being done or pursued, which may, in itself become unhygienic or unhealthy. So there's that. But it's interesting what you were saying, by the way, tudo bem. Oi, tudo bem.
Tudo bem.
I had a lot of Brazilian friends. I would concur with what some of the things that he said in terms of culture shock. To me, culture shock was never a thing because I felt that I think I've expressed this earlier to you as well in our previous conversation where I said that I feel at home more here than I ever did in India. And one of the reasons is that the United States is a potpourri of cultures. If you look at it, the reason why there's so many problems is because with influx of so many cultures, I look at it as an equivalent of India, because in India you have a lot of cultures, even though it's just the same country.
Different languages, tribes,
Yes.
religions.
So there is diversification, except in the United States it's at a national level. You have people coming from different nations. In India, it's just within one country with different cultures, but it's with different nations. Now, what happens with such influx of cultures, is that you can't have a law that directly applies to everyone. So where you do need specific laws, you're often being compelled to generalize, because if you state that this law has to be enforced, then certain groups and certain cultures would feel attacked because that is not something that they would like to be enforced because that's against their beliefs.
Like India just passed a law that Muslim men can't say I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorcee, and
Yes.
that's it.
That is interesting you bring that up because it's actually Muslim women who started that movement in India. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to say, because whenever you're trying to enforce a law, you have to be specific. Everything has to be, very definitive as to what the law governs. You would say that, okay, if a person is found at a crime scene with a knife, then that person cannot just simply be stated as a murderer. You need to have evidence, you need to have specifics. The same way, people are unfortunately having to generalize because they just cannot simply specify. They can't narrow down the elements of, the problems itself. They look at it and they try to generalize, and that's where the cost of administration goes up. And again, people get offended, and then we have what we have.
What I hear from Pakistanis and Indians that surprises them about the U.S. is the isolated nuclear family.
Mm-hmm.
They're used to extended families and borrowing people's shoes and jewelry and don't knock when you come into the bedroom. So did that seem strange to you, the isolated nuclear family?
Like I said again, it really is very subjective. There are families in India, where depending on which class you come from, all of these mannerisms are followed and abided by. But in general, yes, these were a little different to me. But it's very interesting to talk about individualism and, nuclear isolation and all of that. And that is something very interesting to me because my friend out there and I we always discuss about topics like this. To me, it seems that in America, people do that because they want independence. By the time you are all settled and you want to have a good life, preferably with a glass of wine and a good novel to go with it, you're almost at the point where you just want time for yourself, which is why they try to push that idea that, okay, once you're 18, you need to start looking after yourself. Although that is coming from a very, I want to enjoy my part of life too. Yes, it's not all about taking care of kids. It's understandable. But something that really surprised me the most was that here people at every stage of any kind of conversation, they feel the need to specify that, look, this is us, this is you. If you're in trouble, or if you need help, or if you want support, emotional or otherwise, we're always here for you. But you need to know that we're us and you're you. And there's this distinction that starts creeping up into the family. And that's something that I just still to this day, I don't quite understand it.
You're saying us, meaning nuclear
parents.
family?
The parents to their children.
Ah,
I've seen this on numerous occasions where this has happened, and I always assumed that it was more because they wanted financial independence. And it's not something that is one way, it's mutually shared. And again, that is a product of the culture. Kids also nowadays have this idea that if they're not out of their parents' house by the age of 18, they look at themselves and think that, oh, I'm a loser. I'm not capable enough to take care of me, and they get ostracized by either their friends, peers, depending on what kind of company they have. And all of these social evils are something that to me are social evils, because in India I was raised with the idea that if I were ever to become a parent, if I had a son or a daughter, I would always feel that they're never themselves, almost to the point where it's a fault.
got it. Vincent, you're not an immigrant. Tell us about your first ancestors who were. Where did they come from and when?
Sure. In terms of my story, it was my grandparents, and it was that generation that came to the United States. And the reason that they came, it was during the time of the Mexican Revolution. And so, just a quick bit of history, there were 3 armies at war with each other in Mexico at that time. And my grandparents and that generation, they were all farmers in central Mexico. And so what happened is that as the war raged on, the different armies would come through. And so the way the story is told in my family is that the first army that came through, they came and they took what was readily accessible, food, cattle, etc. And then when the second army came through, they took what was left, in terms of goods, of things that could be sold. Well, by the time the third army came through, there was nothing left but the people.
Wow.
And so what happened was that, what happened to my family was that women were taken and they were raped. And some of those women were able to escape and others weren't. And so after that third army came through, my grandparents' generation, they said, that's it, we need to leave. And so when I asked them, I said, well, how did you know when you came to the U.S.? 'Cause it's not like it is today. We're not building, there was no border walls at that time. And they said, well, we knew we had made it to the border with the U.S. because coming up from their point of origination to the border, they had come by train. And so as the various armies had gone through, they would capture and they would shoot, people from the other side. Well, as the war raged on, then there's fewer and fewer bullets, and so they ended up hanging people. And so as they were riding this train coming north, at every telegraph pole, at every pole on the side of the railroad tracks, there were bodies hanging there. And finally, when they got to the point where there were no more bodies, that's when they realized they were in the United States.
What a story.
And so when my family came, they refused to separate, and the entire extended family wanted to come together. And ultimately, a contractor did hire the entire family to go and to pick sugar beets, of all things, in Idaho.
Idaho.
And so, of course, they had no idea, what is this place called Idaho? What are these things called sugar beets? But they knew how to farm, and so they banded together. And so the men, the women, the children all worked together, and they pulled together their money, just as they had pulled their resources to make it to the United States. And they made it to Los Angeles. And so that's where me and my siblings and my cousins, and that's where we were all born and raised.
When I was a young teacher in Los Angeles, Chicano students were often told to take shop classes and not to take college prep classes. Julia Nava was an exception who ended up at Harvard, but it wasn't easy in terms of the system. So how did you get to the PhD level with that kind of
You know,
bias?
I had the very same experience. I will say that I was very much strongly encouraged to take shop classes.
Oh, boy.
And, you know, in terms of, you know, kids in my neighborhood, we were all encouraged to take those kinds of courses. And it wasn't until my last semester of high school and my advisor called me into his office and he said, you know, maybe, you know, you just might be smart enough to go to college.
Wow.
And at that time, they had a bus, and so the program that they had developed was they had one school bus for this entire high school in Los Angeles, and on Fridays during spring semester of your senior year, you would go from college to college, and so one Friday you would go to UCLA, or one Friday you would go to Cal State Long Beach, and so you went to these various places. And so what ended up happening for me was that we were at the Claremont colleges one Friday afternoon, and they were calling kids off the bus, and I was the last kid on the bus, and so they were looking, and they asked me what my name was, and I told them. And they said, well, you're not on our list. And I said, well, I don't understand. I've been on this bus, you know, for a month now. And, you know, this is the first time I've never been called off the bus. And they said, well, you know, did you get your acceptance letter? And I said, no. I said, I'm just waiting to see, you know, when are we going to be applying? And so this person was stunned.
Oh.
And he said, no, applications are due in the fall.
Wow.
This bus is for all the kids who've already been accepted, and now they're having to choose between the various colleges. And so he kind of took me under his wing, and he said, you know, obviously somebody believes that you have potential, and so I'm going to encourage you to go to community college. And then I spent that afternoon learning all about general education courses and CSU and UC transferable, and you know, and he told me, he said, you need to take all of these classes at whatever community college you can get into at this point, and then when you're in the fall semester of your second year, that's when you apply to college. And he gave me his card, and he said, stay in touch with me, you know, and give me a call, because of course that was in the days before email, and I did, and I called them. And I ultimately ended up going to the Claremont colleges, and that's where I got my 4-year degree. So your original question was, how did you end up getting the PhD? And so I've always been into service. My family, we ran a small tiendita, a grocery store in East Los Angeles, literally across the street from Estrada Courts. And so I had learned, you know, all the boys in the family had all learned about service to others. And so I was very naturally drawn into that type of profession. And so I was working at a private nonprofit with persons with disabilities, and the executive director called me into her office, and she said, you know, I've gotten a lot of reports about you. You're a really good guy. People think that you do great work. And she goes, but I got to tell you something. You're operating way beyond your scope of practice. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And so then she explained to me what a social worker was. And she explained to me about getting a master's degree. And so she did the same thing that counselor did back at the Claremont colleges. You know, and she gave me her card. And she goes, go and get your master's degree, and I guarantee that we will hire you as a social worker for our agency. And so I did the same thing. So again, I went back and I earned my master's degree, and it was in the master's program that it was the faculty encouraged me, and they said, you know, you obviously have a long history in training. You've been training other people. You're running groups now here at the university, study groups, and you should really think about getting your PhD. So, long answer to a short question, how did I get here? it was in fits and bits, it was all in little starts, and it was all the encouragement of key individuals who came into my life at various points. But it was never a long-range plan. In my wildest dreams, as a high school student who was being encouraged to take building technology classes, I never, envisioned myself as being a doctoral candidate one day. And so those key individuals were responsible for me being here.
It makes me think of all the other Chicanas who were as smart as you, but didn't run into those kind of helpful people, who...
Right, and that's it. And, our next guest, she is somebody who was one of my students as an undergraduate. And, my colleagues have remarked to me on multiple occasions, said, nobody advises like you do. You sit down and you talk to students and you find out their story. And I said, I need to know that so that I can advise them best, because that's what I benefited from. And I said, I know that, when I was, a freshman, I didn't have that role model in my own family, and I didn't have next door neighbors that I could go to and ask about it. And I'm going to make the assumption that for many of my students, that when they come into my office, they are looking, just like I was all those years ago, for somebody to listen to them, to hear their story, and then to reflect back to them and encourage them in terms of the pursuit of whatever their academic dream is.
Things have changed, because it used to be there were hardly any Latinx students in the CSUs and UCs. You were supposed to quit school and go to work for your family. And now it's changed. So what is it, like a third of
It
Chico
is.
State students?
There's been a significant change. I came to Chico State 14 years ago, and the numbers have exploded since then. And
Why do you think?
Excuse
Why?
me? Why?
What encouraged those students?
I think there are three reasons why those numbers have exploded. Number one, I think that the administration of the university has been very open and has been very receptive to building a campus that is more inclusive of the demographics of the state of California. So I think that's one major factor. Two, I think that there is much better communication that takes place now than there was even 14 years ago between the university and the various high schools, as well as the community colleges. And three, I think that as the number of students in California have increased with regards to the diversity of students who finish high school, I think those are all factors that have contributed to the tremendous growth, particularly at Chico State in terms of the Latinx students.
That's very positive. Martha, you're a dreamer, so tell us a little bit about what DACA is for listeners who aren't really clear. They've heard dreamers, they've heard DACA, but they don't really know what it is.
So DACA is for Action for Childhood Arrival. So it's for people like myself that arrived to the United States when they were under the age. They had to turn 16 here. So
how old were you?
I was 15. I came with the tourist visa to visit my brothers, because very traditional, kind of how we got to Chico. Very traditional. My family,
from
older
Mexico?
brothers from Mexico, central, close to Guadalajara. Born and raised there. My older brothers came, and then they settled, and then brought the next one, and then settled and brought the next one.
Trump calls it chain immigration.
And I'm the seventh one out of 9. So when it was just the last, 3, and my parents were able to get a tourist visa for us, and we came to visit my brothers and just go visit. And then we arrived around December of 1998. And next thing you know, they were enrolling us in high school, and they said, we're going to stay. So I had no idea. I never said bye to people because I was like, oh, I'm just going to go visit for the holidays
Right.
and I'll be back. Very traditional of how a lot of, minors get brought to the United States. They get brought with their families. So I got enrolled in high school and,
And this was in Colorado, you say?
here, no, in Orland.
Orland.
Here, yeah, about
Big
30
dis-
minutes from here, yes. So anyhow, that's how DACA is granted, is you had to be 16, turn 16 here, and have stayed here for a period of time and have a clean record, and you had to be enrolled in high school or college or have a career, and that's how I got my DACA status.
So it's very confusing. Trump said, okay, we'll have a clean DACA bill, nothing else. Then he said, no, we won't have a DACA bill without building the beautiful wall. And then the judge in San Francisco said, no, it's not legal to end DACA. So do you have any clue as to your immigrant status in the midst of this chaos and confusion?
Really up in the air. I just, read and I'm in constant contact with my lawyer, and so the latest is that DACA is pretty much back on because there is a lawsuit. And it was granted that as long as the lawsuit is still on place, DACA is in place. So that means for people that their DACA had expired, then they can now apply for it. But, it's kind of until we don't know when. So as our DACAs, we get it for 2 years, and then every 2 years we have to pay, and we have to apply, and we have to do fingerprint, make sure we're still good citizens, and then they grant us that. If not, then we don't get it again. So now it's up in the air of what's going to happen.
I understand congratulations are in order that you have a baby. Does that influence anything that your baby's a citizen?
No.
No.
No. The laws are really really complicated. So I'm engaged to a citizen, and even that because there's different laws that you had to be here at a certain date and a certain time. That if not, you still have to go to Mexico and then there is complications with that in order to try. So even if I have a citizen child, a citizen husband, it will still be a process, and there might still be a possibility that they won't grant me residency.
When you think of the possibility, what is that like? Do you have family still in Mexico, or are all your immediate family here? How would one handle that kind of huge change?
I don't think about that change because it's not an option for me. My husband is from here. I'm from here now. I've been more than half of my life here. All of my family, parents, siblings, nieces and nephews are here. Yes, I do have extended family, cousins, and aunts and uncles in Mexico, in the town where I grew up, where my home, where I grew up and was raised is there. But my family is here, my life is here, my community is here.
Your job.
My job is here. So that's not a possibility for me. So for me is we will figure out ways to figure it out and stay here.
When you were 15, what surprised you about the U.S., if anything, coming to Orland from Mexico?
I think I was thinking as you all were talking, I think for me, so I grew up in a really, really small town, about 3,000 people. So everybody knew everybody gathered in the plaza at 7, 8 p.m. And then your parents drag you in the house by 10 for bedtime. So it's a very, a community. So I think the biggest thing that surprised me is how segregated almost people, you go, you work, you drive places, and then you come home and then you watch TV. And that was the biggest struggle for me because I was like, okay, there's no social interaction. Where's the plaza? And I found out Chico had a plaza and that nobody was in the plaza. So I was like, what is
people.
What's the point of a plaza? So I think for me that was the biggest thing, just the lack of, community, connection in that sense.
Everyone on the panel is nodding their head. They can identify with that. Yeah, it's very strange, this nuclear family isolation behind the windows and the
Yeah.
TV screen occupying everybody's attention.
It is incredibly, incredibly weird because, like I said earlier, the United States being a potpourri of cultures, at least hosting so many different cultures, it's almost as if those cultures, once they come here, for the purpose of, becoming one with the country's culture, whatever that is, and however that may be defined depending on where you are in the country, in order to properly adapt, it's almost as if they also step into the shoes of this culture and leave behind the better half of their culture. And I think the better half in this example would be communication, basic social communication and interaction with other people.
And sometimes that happens with second-generation students, that they're not as
Yes.
good as, say, first-generation students who get into the UCs.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating because I'm simply not used to seeing no children outside the apartments playing together. In India, right now, at this hour, it would be cracking out there with children laughing,
Right.
playing.
Going in and out of people's
Yes.
homes.
Yeah, just having fun. Here, it's almost as if it's frowned upon. It's not even encouraged. It's not even known. It's almost as if everyone, including a lot of people that I know who are from my country, who then became citizens here. And for instance, I have cousins in Maryland who are very well off, and they're doing really well. They're first generation Americans, and their life is pretty much, although they are culturally from India, those air bunnies, the codes, it's almost as if they lack any of those cultural traits because they're pretty much having or hosting the same idea that they go home, they sit down with a drink, preferably a 64-ounce diet soda.
Yuck.
Or something, and the only kind of interaction there is at that point is whatever happens at the dinner table, and which is a meager exchange of how was your day, did you do your homework, and what are your plans for this weekend, do we have to drive you somewhere. That's pretty much it. It's almost as if it is at the basic
Like a business.
amenity. Exactly.
I will say that when I grew up and when my son grew up, there was like in and out of the neighbors' houses and running around the cul-de-sac and riding our bikes and going up and down. So there are some places where that's still true.
I just want to jump in on that. That was the kind of neighborhood I grew up in Los Angeles.
In East LA?
In East LA. And when I came here, when I first came to Chico, I was renting. And so I rented houses in various parts of Chico. And so by the time I was ready to buy a house, I knew exactly which neighborhood. And I've shared this story many times with my students. And when I met with the real estate agent, I was very proud. I was very happy. I had been granted tenure status at Chico State. And at that time, one of the benefits was that you would get a letter of credit from CalPERS. And so I had a letter of credit to buy a house. And so when I met with the real estate agent, we met downtown at the Naked Lounge, and we were talking. And so she was very excited that she was going to meet this tenured professor, and she knew at that time everybody knew about these letters of credit. And so she started asking me about, she goes, well, where do you want to buy a house? And she started naming these various neighborhoods, and I just kept shaking my head and no. And she goes, well, where do you want to buy a house? And I said, I want to buy a house in Chapmantown. And she was flabbergasted, and she looked at me and she goes, but you don't have to buy a house in Chapmantown. I said, I know I don't have to, but that's the neighborhood I want to live in. And a lot of going back and forth, and I had to threaten to fire her as my real estate agent. And was actually, she never did find a house for me. And it was the woman who is next to me at the university. her and her husband had been purchasing houses, and so she had been keeping an eye out. And so she had listened to a lot of my stories about growing up with fruit trees and growing up with kids running in and out of each other's houses,
Right.
and and people being out on the street. And she said, "I have the house for you," and that was the house that I bought, and it was exactly what I wanted. And so the very first barbecue that I had in my backyard, I invited family and friends, and I invited the neighbors so that everybody could meet each other. And it was this great, get together of different people, and people were talking that had never met each other before.
A block party.
And it has continued that way to this day. And I truly enjoy living in Chapmantown and being able to sit on the porch. And in the summertime, there are people going back and forth on skateboards and bikes. I live right across from the Dorothy Johnson, and there's always guys walking down the street with basketballs and going over there. And that's, that community, can be found in 2018. It is possible.
Right.
But I think it's important for somebody like me, and as I'm listening to my fellow panelists, I think that's something that all of us, we all share in common, that we all look for. And so I think, it is in that community spirit that as we're talking about immigration and what's happening and what our perspectives, I think the things that draw people to the United States and the things that keep people in the United States, it is that sense of community. It is that sense of localism, of being able to talk to your neighbors and to share the good times and the bad times.
I was cooking the Christmas dinner and my oven went out. So you need to have the turkey in the oven all day. And my neighbors, a couple of them shared their ovens with me. So that I really appreciate having that kind of support. It means a lot. Quirino, you just got back from Brazil. So I'm really interested in how your woman president, Dilma Rousseff, got ousted in a coup. And I'm interested in how students are opposing the neoliberal austerity programs under President Temer. What did you see in terms of the atmosphere there, and how I just read there's new protests about the fare raises in Sao Paulo, which started the 2013 demonstrations. Catch us up, please.
Yeah, I think it's definitely dishonorable or maybe despicable what happened with our president, a female president, Dilma Rousseff, who was first woman president of the country, who had taken on the legacy from Lula.
President Lula.
Yeah, President Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, that's his full name, but everybody knows him by Lula. So there's a working class fellow who only with a fourth grade elementary school was able to run a country in a way that probably most people with high level of education, higher level, the highest level of education have never been able to accomplish in history. So it's fabulous. So Dilma Rousseff was carrying pretty much the legacy of siding with the people, the working class, improving minimum wages, getting better job for everybody, distributing education, making sure that the poor could attend universities. I luckily was able to enter University of Sao Paulo, pass the national entrance examination. I'd say probably I was lucky. So a competition such as the one at the University of Sao Paulo is not anybody who can make that. It's really, really, really tough. And coming from a working class, we talk about our origins before, where we come from. I also come from a poor family. And no higher education involved, no college on both sides of the family. My mother could barely read or write, and my father had an education such as Lula, fourth grade.
Wow.
He was a petty merchant. So we would not have been able to make that to to college under regular circumstances. It was a little, maybe they saw something that I could accomplish, and like Professor Mel has mentioned before. So those things that somebody there, a smart, intelligent, caring person sees that you have some potentials, and then that little push can help you. And that's what happened. So I earned a scholarship at the beginning, getting out of actually elementary school, and then I later on got more help, and then ended up competing at the University of Sao Paulo. So anyway, so I'm telling you this story because it can illustrate a little bit the plight of many people who would not have been able to go to college without Lula's help at the beginning. Lula Inácio da Silva, who expanded the universities or created more universities, signed the decrees which would put the money available to open the doors of universities where universities had never been, right? Not only putting the universities at those locations, but having the higher education institutions open for the public. So the numbers are substantial. If you look at this, the statistics, I'm not going to bore anybody with numbers here, but the increase in the period of say around 2000 to say the time that Dilma left, was impeached, or the coup took place and they ousted her unfairly. So we're talking about an increase of, I don't know, 50% maybe of the number of openings for students.
Huge.
Yeah, all over the country. And also, not only did they do that for education, but they did for access in general, like finding employment or having job insurance, employment insurance, those kinds of things. So it's a big increase. And if you also think in terms of numbers, between Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, that's 2016, right, when she leaves. So we talk about probably 30% of the folks who never had access to anything who were brought up to having at least a minimum wage, getting employment. So 30% of the population was brought from the bottom up to access.
How were they able to get rid of Dilma in a coup? If she was a man, would they have been able to succeed?
Most likely not. My hunch is that not, and because of the gender issue, so maybe I may be generalizing here, but it may be that some of the folks, senators, congressmen, didn't believe that she was competent enough to perform the job, and then she, maybe by an act of inadvertently doing something unconsciously, following the lead of some folks, she signed a document when she was part of the council of the Brazilian National Petroleum Company. So she signed the document, and then that the document favored some folks in politics, and Brazil, not much different from here, maybe Mexico and other countries, India, for example. Systemic corruption is there.
Yes.
So we tend to look at politics and exempt ourselves, right? Waive our, I don't know, waive the fact that corruption is there, and that's what they think they counter in corruption.
We need to thank our sponsors. I want to let you know that Ask Dr. Gail is on the second Thursday of each month from 6 to 7. And next month in February, we're carrying on the theme of immigrants, only we're going to focus on Scandinavians. Because whenever I look for a model of egalitarian, caring countries, I always go to Scandinavia in my research. So if anyone knows Scandinavians in Chico, please ask them to contact Ask Dr. Gale at gkimball@csuchico.edu. Ask Dr. Gale is made possible by the generous contributions of KZFR supporters and by Burchard Construction, specializing in custom remodels, new home and commercial building from foundation to finish work. Burchard Construction, where the homeowner input matters to ensure a professional, reliable, and quality result. Custom construction with beauty and function. For bids and consultations, call Adam Burchard at 864-5427 or visit burchardconstruction.com. Ask Dr. Gale is also brought to you by Chico Skywatch, offering an informational film about geoengineering and aerosol climate spraying on the fourth Thursday of every month at no charge. Chico Skywatch also sends local water samples to a state-certified lab for heavy metals testing. More information at chicoskywatch.org and at the weekly Saturday Chico Farmers Market. I also wanted to say that now that the semester is starting up again for the spring, I have a new book out, an ebook that's very inexpensive called Your Mindful Guide to Academic Success, Prevent Burnout. And it's a collection of voices from students around the world and experts talking about the traditional things, how to study, how to write papers, how to take tests, but it also has information on health, wellness, stress management, student activism, that kind of thing. So let's go back to Vivekanand and tell us, I'm really interested in poverty in India because there's states like Kerala that do a beautiful job of education, healthcare for most people. And I'm wondering now that Modi, as a Hindu nationalist, is kind of on the right, what are you seeing in terms of programs to make sure that half the Indians get toilets that they don't have and get access to school and early marriage for girls?
See, elevation of social evils that are prevalent quite extensively in Indian society is not an easy task to tackle. It's certainly not a one man's job. It's certainly not a task that is possible within just even the next decade. It is that extensive. Although there are definitely a lot of programs that have been there even before Modi came into power, that have been trying to tackle these issues. But the only problem is that since they're not funded by powerful sponsors, they're not as well known of, and their awareness is quite limited. And I think it's more of a civic duty than it is a concern of someone in power to take care of these things, because like how my Brazilian counterpart here just said earlier, corruption is so extensive. I'll give you a very small example. In India, this is a personal experience. This happened with me. What happened was in India, whenever I used to have my exams during my undergrad, they used to look at the papers for evaluation. Okay,
and is this in a government school or private school?
This is a private school.
College.
Yes, private school, but it is the same everywhere. What used to happen was the evaluators would see the paper. While they were grading it, they would ascertain whether or not this person is capable of passing. Right away, if it is quite clear that yes, this person will easily pass, they would intentionally fail you.
Wow.
Because the idea was that if you received a failed grade, you had the right as a citizen to apply for reevaluation or reassessment of the paper,
but
which would come at a certain fee. And quite tactfully so, what they used to do was they used to not disclose the results of the reevaluation or reassessment until after you took the exam, the re-exam, which any student, just by the virtue of their fear of wanting to progress, would take. So there's another fee for that. And for those two fees combined, I went through this process almost 5 times. But that is not even the plight of the situation. The plight of the situation is that, okay, let us say that every man becomes a slave to the corruption that they grow up in. But that's not where it stops. Where it really impedes a person with dreams, with potential, is the fact that when they do the reevaluation, they don't even grant you the actual grade that you deserve. They give you only the passing grade because they're simply not interested and invested enough with conviction to give someone what they need. And that deeply hurts the merit of a person. And obviously, that person will find it difficult to find a job in a merit-based society such as India with companies, even if they're startups, because your grades do reflect your potential. Well, I'm not a person who believes in paper manifestations of who you are. However, it does to some degree quantify your capabilities, and that's where it impedes that person and deeply hurts that person. And I have been a victim of that almost 5 times. I say 5 times, almost 5 times, because the 5th time I made up my mind that, okay, I will commit to a sin, a crime of bribery, because I do not want to be in India any longer. There's no way that I can get a job legally. I would have to buy myself anyway. Rather than that, why not apply abroad? Get out of here. Maybe for the simple hope of a brighter future, and even a stronger and a deeper wistful thinking that, you know, your children wouldn't grow up in an environment such as this, where it's about nepotism, there's corruption, and you just don't want to grow up with that. So all of this, again, translates to poverty, because usually necessity is the mother of invention. So similarly, necessity is also the mother of strong motivation. And families where they're not all that well off, their only motivation is to get their parents and themselves out of the situation. So there are significantly higher number of performers in low-income families, but they never end up qualifying into being able to apply for good jobs and getting in there in the first place because of this widespread corruption. Now, there's no awareness, unfortunately. So despite all instruments, implementations, and execution that there is from the government's behalf and of other private companies which try to do their own share of good, how they put it as corporate social responsibilities, which also is a way for you to cut down on your taxes that a corporation has to pay, none of that is actually being used for the good that it actually does. Because in the end, the state of the country is the same. It is a very, very slow growing organism, which is not able to battle with its own internal cancers. And that's why people ask, what would a country do if it's not able to battle with its own internal cancers? How would it stand against other challenges that are coming up from abroad? And no one would want to live in a country rightfully and fully aware of the situation and say, this is where I want to live and pursue my dreams, because you're pretty much living in a false reality. So with poverty, it's the same situation. So even with alleviating conditions for the poor in terms of giving them access to basic amenities, all those funds through charities are usually dispersed through other channels where it's usually for corruption and put to other uses, but for that one purpose that it was there for in the first place.
I know that you got offered a good job and that you're waiting for the right immigrant status. How's that going?
So it is a very complicated procedure, and I really did physically get goosebumps when you were talking, because I have been in those shoes where I was also putting myself. I'm in the same place, simply put, because to me that's not an alternate reality. That's an alternate hell. I do not want to consider that in the first place. So unfortunately, the procedure is, I wouldn't say unfortunately, there's a reason for why there are certain procedures, so I respect that. But what's unfortunate about this one procedure is that for an immigrant to be able to work in the United States, they need a visa called H-1B1, which is quite widely known of. Now, the problem is that America has this, I wouldn't say America in general, I don't want to be, targeted later in the future. But I want to say that, it's not merit-based, and your name doesn't come out based on merit, it's just a lottery. So unless your name is pulled out of
Oh my
a lottery of
goodness.
visas, you don't get it.
So, do you have any guesstimate how long it will take?
It usually takes 6 months for you to clearly know whether or not you got it.
Oh boy, all of us have our fingers crossed for everybody who needs it.
And just to go off of that, is very different from country to country, because my brother petitioned for me 18 years ago, and we're still waiting.
No.
So I already have a petition, and because it's from sibling to sibling, it's waiting there. All my documents are there, but because it's the neighbor country, we don't get as many allotted work permits as other countries because of the majority. So it's very different. A lot of people are like, oh, you're getting married, you can get, and it's not that simple. It's very, very complicated. Even if I already have an application or whatever else, even if I have a degree. So.
Thank you very much for listening to Ask Dr. Gail, Quirino, Vivekanand, Vincent, Martha. Thank you very much. And now stay tuned for Sandy, peanut butter and jelly time. Yay!
Closing music? Do you have closing music?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, I never do tapes. Thank you.
I like the voice. Actually, yeah. Did you ever read Catherine?